What is up, guys? Welcome to Barton. My name is Heinrich, and today we're going to take a look at damaging the player if he accidentally touches the enemy, like this. As you can see, when we touch the enemy, he gets knocked back, we can dash through the enemy, and eventually, if the enemy damages us enough, we will die, and then, in a couple of seconds, respawn. Let's get into it. So we're going to start off by heading into our scripts folder, enemies folder, and then opening our basic enemy controller script. We can start off by declaring some variables. Our touch damage is going to work with a cooldown. So we'll start off by declaring a private float that we're going to call last touch damage time. And this is going to store the last time our enemy damaged our player. Next, we need to have a touch damage cooldown variable. So private float touch damage cooldown. We also need to know how much damage the touch damage does. So we'll say touch damage. And how the touch damage is going to work is we're going to have a bounding box or a little area over the enemy where if the player enters that area, he will take damage. So we need to set a width and a height for that area. So we'll say touch damage width and touch damage height, just like that. We also need to come to our private layer mask and declare another layer mask that is going to be what is player. To detect the player, we're going to use physics2d.overlapArea. Overlap area takes in two parameters, the bottom left corner and the top right corner. So we'll come down to our private vector2 and we're going to make two more vector2s. The first one is going to be called touch damage bot left, and the other one is touch damage top right. And then lastly, we need to keep track of the attack details that we're going to send to our player via the send message function. So we'll come underneath our private floats and we'll declare another private float, but this time it's going to be an array. And we'll call it attack details, and we'll set it equal to a new float array of size 2. That's it for the variables. We can now come down to our other functions section and start writing the touch damage function. I'm going to write it right below our other damage function. So we'll say private void, and I'm going to call it check touch damage. Inside the function, we'll start by checking the cooldown. So we'll say if time.time is greater than or equal to last touch damage time plus touch damage cooldown. This means enough time has passed since the last time the enemy damaged something to damage it again. Inside the if, we'll then start by determining the two corners. I forgot another variable that we need. So let's come back up to our variables. And we need another transform. This will be the touch damage check position. So we'll just say touch damage check. This will be a game object that's a child of our enemy that'll be the center of the touch damage area. Let's come back down to our function. And in the if statement, we'll start by determining the two corners of the area. So we'll say touch damage bottom left dot set, and for our x parameter we will use touch damage check dot position dot x, and from this we will subtract half of our width, so touch damage width divided by 2. Then for our y parameter we will say touch damage check dot position dot y, and we'll subtract half of the height. So touch damage height divided by 2. We can then just copy this line and paste it back in, and this time we will do the top right position. And all that's different is we just have to change all the subtracts to pluses. Like that. Next, we can actually cast the overlap area. So we'll start off by declaring a collider2d that we'll call hit, and that is going to store the game object that the overlap area detects. So we'll set this equal to physics2d dot overlap area, and for the parameters we're going to pass in the touch damage bottom left and touch damage top right. And then finally we're going to pass in the whatisPlayer layer mask. After this we're then going to say if hit does not equal null, meaning our overlap area has detected the player, then we're going to say last touch damage time equals time.time, and then we need to set our attack details. So attack details 0 equals touch damage, and attack details 1 equals alive.transform.position.x. Remember, we're passing the x position of the enemy to the player. That way the player knows from what side he's being damaged, meaning we can apply the knockback in the right direction. Finally, we can then say hit.sendMessage, and the function we're trying to send the message to is damage, and we're passing attack details as the parameter. All we need to do now is call check touch damage from the states where we want the enemy to be able to damage the player. So we'll come up to our update moving state, and in here underneath the ground detected and wall detected lines we'll just say check touch damage. And that should be it for the basic enemy controller. So let's go back to Unity and then open up our player controller script. In the script we're now going to write the knockback function for the player. So let's start off by declaring the variables we're going to need. The first variable we're going to need is another private boolean called knockback. We then need two more floats, one that's going to be the knockback start time and one that's going to be the knockback duration. So we'll come up to our private floats and we'll say knockback start time, and then we'll have a serialized field private float knockback duration. We then finally need a serialized field private vector2 that is our knockback speed. We can now write our knockback and knockback check functions just like we have on the dummy and the enemy. So we'll come down and we'll say private void knockback. Inside the function we'll start by setting knockback equals true, and then we'll set the knockback start time equal to time.time. And now we need to apply the knockback velocity. So this time we actually need to have a parameter for the knockback function that's going to be an int, and we'll call it direction. We can then say rb.velocity equals a new vector2, and for the x we'll just use knockback speed.x multiplied with direction, and for the y we'll just use knockback speed.y. Like that. And now we need to write the check knockback function. So right underneath this we'll say private void check knockback. In this function all we have to say is if time.time is greater than or equal to knockback start time plus knockback duration. Then we can say knockback equals false and rb.velocity equals a new vector2, and we'll just say 0.0 f on the x and rb.velocity.y on the y. Now we just need to come to our apply movement function, and in the first if statement we'll say and not knockback, and in the else if we'll also add and not knockback. This way our movement cannot override our knockback. We also need to come down to our flip function and add not knockback. We can now come to our player combat controller script and write the damage function for the player. So we'll say private void, and it's called damage. And it's important that it's always damage with a capital D, otherwise our send message will not work. This function takes in a parameter that is going to be a float array, and we're going to call it attack details. Inside the function, we will then first determine what direction the player is supposed to be knocked back. So we'll say int direction, and then we'll say if attack details 1 is less than transform.position.x, then that means that our enemy x position is less than our player x position, meaning the enemy is to the left of the player, meaning the enemy is probably facing right, so direction should equal 1. Else, direction should equal -1. We then need to call our knockback function. So let's come back to our player controller, and we actually need to make our knockback function public. So let's find our knockback function and change it from private to public. In our player combat controller script, we then need to get a reference to our player controller script. So let's come up to our variables and say private player controller, and we'll just call it capital P, capital C. In our start function, we can then say PC equals get component of type player controller. In our damage function, we can then come down and say PC.knockback, and we'll pass it direction. In this function, we can also take care of damaging the player, but I have not yet figured out how I want damaging, dying, and respawning to work. So we'll just leave a comment for now to remind us to come back to this later. So we'll say damage player here using attack details 0. I also want to make it so that our player can dash through our enemy without getting damaged. So let's head to our player controller script. And let's write a public function called get-status. So we'll say public bool get-status. And this function will simply return whether or not the player is currently dashing or not. So we can just say return is dashing. In our player combat controller script, we can then encapsulate everything in the damage function in an if statement that'll be if not pc.get-status. So if the player is not dashing, that is when he will get damaged. Like that. We now want to be able to visualize the box that damages the player. So let's head to our basic enemy controller script, and let's come down to our onDrawGizmos function. To do this, we're going to draw lines connecting the 4 corners of the box. So first, we need to declare 4 vector2s for each one of the corners, and then we need to determine what those are, and then finally we need to draw those lines. So we're going to have a vector2 that we'll call bottom left, and then we're going to have another vector2 that we'll call bottom right, one called top right, and then one last one called top left. Let's just come up to our check touch damage function and copy what is inside this set function. We can then come down to our onDrawGizmos function again, and we'll start off by setting bottom left equal to a new vector2, and we'll just paste in the parameters. And now let's copy this whole equal sign, and let's just paste it into the bottom right vector2. So let's check the logic. Seeing as it's the bottom and it's on the right, we want to subtract from the y, but we want to add to the x. For top right, we want to add to the x and add to the y. And then for top left, we just want to subtract from the x and add to the y. Just like that. And now finally, all we have to do is draw the lines between the different points. So let's say gizmos.draw line from bot left to bot right. And then gizmos.draw line, this time from bot right to top right. And then gizmos.draw line from top right to top left. And then finally, gizmos.draw line from top left to bot left. Just like that. So if we save this and head back into Unity, and then click on our live game object and create a new child that will call touch damage check, and then click on our enemy1 game object and drag this touch damage check game object into the reference slot, and then set a width and a height, we can see a little box appear. This is the bounding box for our touch damage. We can now move our touch damage check game object to position this where we want it, and then we'll play around with the width and the height to get it the right size. So I'm going to make my width a little bigger, say 1.5, and my height just slightly smaller at like 0.9. I think that fits well. I'm also just going to move it up slightly, just like that. We can then click on our enemy1 game object again and set the rest of our variables. I see I made a mistake by putting last touch damage time in the serialized field float section. We want that to be just a normal private float. We'll change that just now. We'll make our touch damage cooldown 0.2 seconds. Our touch damage is going to be 10, but that doesn't matter for right now because we're not actually damaging the player yet. We also need to set what is player to player. We can then click on our player and just make sure he's on the player layer. We can then also open the player controller script and just add our knockback speed and knockback duration. I'm going to use 0.1 for the knockback duration and 10 for the knockback speed X and 5 for the knockback speed Y. In your player controller script, don't forget to call check knockback from update. We then also want to come back to our check knockback function and add and knockback, so that this only happens if we are currently being knocked back. If we head back to Unity and run the game, you can see the enemy touches us and we get knocked back and we can start moving again. While we get knocked back, we can't change how we move, but the knockback happens really quickly, so it doesn't really affect the gameplay. You can mess around with the knockback duration and the knockback speeds to get the effect you want. At some point we'll take a look at adding some juice, like pausing the game for a split second when the enemy or player gets damaged, but we'll leave that for a different episode. For now, we're basically done with having the enemy damage the player. Let's go ahead and fix some things. Firstly, we need to fix the combat dummy no longer being able to get damaged. So let's head to our enemies folder and open up our combat dummy script. And then all we need to do is in our damage function, change the input parameter from float to a float array that we'll call details. And we'll start off by saying current health minus equals details 0, as that is our attack damage. And now we don't actually need this player facing direction equals pc.getFacing direction anymore, seeing as we're passing the x position of the thing doing the damage. So we can delete this line and we'll say if details 1 is less than alive go.transform.position.x, meaning the thing doing the damage is to the left of the dummy, we'll set player facing direction equal to 1, else we'll set player facing direction equal to -1. Let's head back to Unity and test. So now we can damage our dummy again, and he will still break like he always does. And we can hit our enemy, and our enemy can move us around. We can dash through our enemy and not take any damage. I also want to click on our player and just mess around with the dash for a little bit. I'm going to change the dash time from 0.02 to 0.1, just so you don't dash as far. That makes it feel a little bit better and controllable. So I messed around with the knockback variables a bit and found that 0.2 for the duration and 15 for the X and 15 for the Y works quite well for me. It knocks you back far enough so I don't continuously run into the enemy if I'm running towards him. Okay, so now that we got the enemy detecting the player and knocking him back, we can start to actually do damage to the player. So let's come to our player script folder, and let's create a new script, and we'll just call it player stats. Let's open that up in Visual Studio, and we can just delete the pre-generated code. We'll start off by declaring a serialized field, and we'll have a private float variable called max health. We're also going to take care of spawning in some particles when the enemy gets damaged in this script. So let's make another serialized field, and this will be a private game object, and we'll have two, and we'll have our death chunk particle, and then our death blood particle. Lastly, we just need a private float current health. That will just keep track of what the current health of the player is. Now let's start with our start function, and inside we'll say current health equals max health. That's all we need in there for now. Next, we want a way of decreasing the health of the player. So we'll make a public function, and it's going to be void, and we'll just call it decrease health. And we'll make it so this function has an input parameter that is going to be a float, and it's going to be the amount to decrease the health by. Inside this function, we can then just say current health minus equals amount. After this, we can then check to see what the health is, and if it is below 0, we can kill the player. So we'll say if current health is less than or equal to 0.0f, then die. And then we just need to write the die function, which is going to be private void die. And in here, we will just instantiate the particles and then destroy the game object. So we'll say instantiate, and we're going to start with the chunk particle, so death chunk particle, and we'll instantiate it on transform.position. And then we also just want the death chunk particle .transform.rotation as the rotation. And then we can just do the same thing with the blood particles. So instantiate death blood particle transform.position death blood particle .transform.rotation. Just like that. And then finally we can just say destroy game object. So when the die function is called, we'll instantiate the particles just like we do for the enemy, and then we'll destroy the player game object. For now, I'm just going to use the same chunk and blood particle that I used for the enemy, but feel free to make different particles for your player. So now to call our decrease health function, we need to come to our player combat controller, and then in our variables, we need to make a reference to our player stats script. So we'll say private player stats, and I'll just call it PS. Don't forget to save your player stats. And then in start, we'll say PS equals get component player stats. We can then come down to our damage function, and we can just remove this comment, and we'll say ps.decrease health, and we'll pass attack details 0. So if we save this and then go back to Unity and click on our enemy, make sure our damage is set, so our touch damage is 10. And then we can come to our player, and we just need to drag on the player stats script that we just made. And then we'll set our health to something like 50. And we'll go to our prefabs folder, and I'm just going to drag in the death blood particle and the death chunk particle. And we can play this. So now if the enemy touches us 5 times, so 3, 4, 5, we die and the game object gets destroyed. Now let's just make a super simple respawn mechanic. So to do this, we'll use a game manager. So let's come to our scripts and create a new folder, and I'm just going to call it manager. And inside this folder, I'll then create a new script that I'll call game manager. I'm then also going to come to the hierarchy and create a new empty game object that I'll call game manager. And then I'm just going to reset the transform and drag it up to the top, and then add the game manager script to this game object. So let's open this up in Visual Studio. And this respawn mechanic is going to be super simple. It's not going to do anything with resetting the scene. It's literally just going to respawn the player, and everything else stays the same. So any damage we've done to the enemies, any enemies that we've killed will stay that way. But this is just to give you an idea of how to do a super simple respawn mechanic. You can always have a reset function on your enemy script that resets its health, and in your game manager you can also respawn enemies that have died. But we'll take care of things like that later. We're just keeping it super simple for now. We'll start off by declaring a serialized field that is going to be a private transform. And this transform is going to be the respawn point. And then we also need a serialized field that's going to be private game object. And this will just be the player. Now this isn't going to be the player game object that's in the hierarchy. Instead, we're going to make our player into a prefab, and that's what this reference is going to hold. That way we can just instantiate the player again. And then next, we need another serialized field that is a private float, and this is going to hold our respawn time, which is just how long after we die do we respawn. Next, we need a private float that's just going to be respawn time start, and then a private bool that we'll just call respawn. So let's start by writing our respawn function. We'll say public void, because we want to call this function from our player script when he dies, and we'll just call it respawn. And then inside the script, we'll just say respawn time start equals time.time. And then we'll also set respawn equal to true. Then we just need to write a check respawn function. So private void check respawn, and this function will just take care of checking to see if enough time has passed, and when enough time has passed, it'll respawn the player. So we'll say if time.time is greater than or equal to respawn time start plus respawn time. And then inside the if statement, we'll just say instantiate, and we're instantiating the player, and we are putting it on the respawn point, just like that. We then just need to come up and create our update function. Inside the update function, we just call check respawn. Now, when our player gets destroyed, our camera, our Cinemachine component, will lose its look at target. So when we respawn the player, we just need to set the cinemachine look at to our player. So when we instantiate the player, let's just keep track of that game object by saying var player temp equals instantiate. And then now we need to get access to our cinemachine. So we just need to come up to the top and say using cinemachine. And this is basically like importing the cinemachine. We then need to come to our variables and create a private, and the component we're looking for, if we go to Unity real quick, go to our cameras, player camera, is the cinemachine virtual camera. You can see here is our follow component. I just realized I said look at before, I meant to say follow. So let's come back to our code. So we have a private cinemachine virtual camera. And we'll just call it CVC for cinemachine virtual camera. We then need to create our start function. And in the start function, we'll say CVC equals game object dot find. And the game object we're looking for is our player camera. You need to make sure that it's exactly the same as you have it written out here in the hierarchy. So player camera, and then we'll say dot get component of type cinemachine virtual camera, just like that. We also, in our check respawn function, need to put and respawn in the if statement. I forgot that. Okay, now to add the follow reference to the cinemachine virtual camera, we'll come to where we spawn the player, so var player temp, and after this we'll say CVC dot, and we're looking for m underscore follow, and then we just set this equal to player temp dot transform, and then right after this we just need to set respawn equals false, like that. So now if we come back to Unity, we can create a new empty game object, and we'll just call it respawn point. And then we need to reset its transform. And I'm just going to make this a child game object of our game manager. And then I'm going to move it to wherever I want the player to respawn. So let's put it inside here maybe. And then we can click on our game manager and then drag in our respawn point into the respawn point. We also need to click on our player and then come to our prefabs folder and just drag our player into the prefabs folder. Now, very important, you need to click on your prefab and set the X and the Y position to 0. We can then come to our game manager and drag our player prefab into the player slot. And we'll just make our respawn time something like 5 seconds. So we actually need to come to our player stats script, which is here. And then we need to get a reference to our game manager script. So we'll say private game manager, and we'll just call it GM. And then in our start function, we will say GM equals game object dot find, and we're looking for our game manager, and we'll say dot get component of type game manager. So this will now give us access to the respawn function in our game manager script. And so when we die right before we destroy the game object, and it's important that we say this before destroy, because once the game object gets destroyed, the script gets destroyed with it, so it won't actually get to any code after this. So we'll just say gm.respawn. And we'll save that. Now if we go to Unity and play the game, we'll let the enemy kill us. We'll wait 5 seconds and then we should respawn. Just like that. As you can see, we can go about our day. And if we hit the enemy twice and then die, once we respawn, it should just take 1 hit to kill the enemy. Now this isn't ideal. Eventually we'll come up with some way to reset the scene once we die, or come up with what the conditions for the death are. So do we have a number of lives before the scene resets? Things like that. Okay, and that does it for this part. Next we're going to take a look at juicing up getting damaged by the enemy a bit and damaging the player. We're going to add things like freezing the game for a split second to add some impact, and maybe putting some visual cues like the enemy and the player blinking or flashing to indicate that they've been damaged. And then we'll also head on and create some more complicated behaviors for the enemy. I hope you guys managed to learn something from this part, and I would like to give a big thanks to all my supporters and wonderful people on Patreon, and a huge thanks to the absolute mad lad Mason Crow for his support on Patreon. I hope you guys all have a wonderful day.